Out of the street corners they scream. You knew it was coming. You've been waiting for this for months. Rumour hardened into fear and now they scream at you. The sirens, their hysterical wail tearing through the white noise of the city. And you run. You run to pick up those things that can never be replaced. A picture of them in the days when they still loved you. Your mother's wedding ring. And then you turn to your shelf of games. You only have room for 5. 5 games for Doomsday. 5 Games for Doomsday is a show in which board game personalities are thrust into a cabin in the woods to outrun an oncoming disaster, but can only take 5 of their games with them. But which will they choose? My guest this week is a game designer, games composer, author and general renaissance man of the gaming world. He's designed both analog and digital games, including Jelly Bomber, Oro and Dragon Bridge. He also writes about game design and has published 2 books, Clockwork Games Design and Game Design Theory. My guest today is Keith Burgun. Keith, welcome to the cabin.
Hello, thank you for having me.
So I guess my first question is what I usually ask people is, how difficult was it for you to choose the 5 games to take to the cabin?
The hardest thing, and I don't know if you get this a lot, but the hardest thing is like trying to, guess at what you're trying to get at with the question. Because actually if I'm taking it quite literally, then I'm going to pick actually some games that I don't actually really want to play right now. You know what I mean? Because it's a different world. If it's like this, doomsday situation. So the classic example of a game like that is Dwarf Fortress, which is a game that if I were locked in a dungeon, for the rest of my life, and I could only take 1 game in there, it would probably be Dwarf Fortress. Or another game like that. Nethack comes to mind as another game that's one of these things where it just has like this endless complexity and emergent qualities and just so much in it to explore. And I'm not really interested in that now, but if I were locked in, if I was locked in a dungeon or a post-apocalyptic situation, I would be interested in that. So I kind of split the difference in terms of, what are things that I actually just really love and that represent me, and games that would be good in the apocalypse, sort of, but that I also appreciate and think are really remarkable, like Dwarf Fortress.
So when you think about, so I interview people who basically deal with analog games, and they're very much artifacts, and I come from digitally like an age of cartridges and boxes and sort of novel length instruction books for video games that were completely pointless. Whereas today, there's a lot of digital downloads and using Steam and things like that. Do you see games as artifacts, things to be conserved? And how would you feel about Doomsday robbing you of them?
So I guess I would say I don't particularly care about the physicality of games, and I'm willing to admit that I may be really missing something there. But my true, honest opinion about it is that and they may be. So I also come from the era of the 80s when everything was an artifact, a physical object, and so I get the. So I worked at a Funko Land, which I guess you probably don't have over there, but like. It was like an old games, reseller sort of store where people could bring in their old games and we would buy them from them and we would resell them. So we had all these retro games. It eventually got bought by a GameStop. And what happened was I was working there while it was transitioning to becoming a GameStop. And so people would bring in all these games that they were trying to offload. And I would be like, you know what? This company is not taking them anymore because we're turning into a GameStop, but I will take them off your hands for 50 cents. And so I actually developed quite a collection for a while, a good 10 years there, plus my own, childhood collection. And I started sort of becoming a little bit of a video game collector. And at some point about 8 or 9 years ago, I just started getting rid of it all because I have emulators. I had a modded Wii that I could play all of the like NES and Genesis games on and all that kind of stuff. And so at the same time, I was kind of getting into board games a lot more too. But I don't know that I love board games for their components so much. Like I know that that's a big thing that people are very into, and the whole Kickstarter like revolution is very componential. And I never got into like Magic the Gathering or collectible card games. So I guess I'm very much on the side of the spectrum that's doesn't care that much about the physicality, the actual physical components. And so if I were trapped on the island, I'd be like, well, you know what? Race for the Galaxy, it still exists because I know the rules to it and I can write them down, and we can we can sort of approximate it using some components that we can put together, and then that's Race for the Galaxy. So to me, games are their rules. They are fundamentally abstract, I guess, and that's kind of the angle I come at. But I also wouldn't proclaim like there's no value in the physicality, and I think that a lot of people get a lot out of that, and that's great, and it's cool, and it's just this other thing that games can do.
It's a non-IP infringing cabin in the woods, by the way. But going back to the beginning, then you've sort of mentioned it. When did games enter your life? And I remember a friend of mine having an NES and Mega Man and being absolutely wowed by it. Were you of that generation, or is that a bit later?
So I was born in 1982, and when I was about 3 years old, my parents, who always were really cool about me playing video games, possibly too cool about it, got an Atari, and so I was playing Atari 2600. Games like Adventure and Combat are the biggest ones that I remember really playing a lot of, and that may speak to some of my sort of abstract tendencies with thinking about games. These are both highly abstract, and combat's a very systemic sort of thing. And so that was my earliest things. Then I remember seeing, actually I was living in Saudi Arabia at the time, strangely enough, and I had a friend who owned an NES, and I think I remember playing Kung Fu. But I also, weirdly enough, remember playing, so it must be been a little bit like later, but I remember playing the Rambo NES game, very strange, which was kind of a ripoff of the Zelda 2. Those are some of my earliest digital game memories that I have. And then, from there, I got really into making mazes when I was a little kid. And so there was a lot of, I never wanted to do mazes, but I always wanted to make mazes for other people to do. So I guess those, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's like the earliest memories of games, and I didn't get into tabletop until way later. And in fact, one thing I really regret is that I didn't play D&D at all until I was like in my mid 20s, was the first time I played D&D. I think I was sort of culturally, I was kind of like an art kid, I guess, growing up, more than like a geek, a traditional geek. Like I didn't read Lord of the Rings. I wasn't like into Star Wars. I wasn't into like any of that stuff. I was in like rock bands, and like I wanted to draw and all that kind of stuff. I was like, maybe culturally separated from some of the arenas which would have tuned me in more to things like board games and tabletop gaming. And so I didn't get into that until much later. And then when I found out about that stuff, I just like went on a tear. Like a 10-year long, tirade of just, I did all these board game geek trades, and I just really went nuts with it to try to catch up a little bit. But that's kind of my background in games.
So you said you mentioned you lived in Saudi Arabia. You also lived in the UK as a child. Why was that? And what do you remember about those countries and how they differ from being an American, living in America?
So I lived in the UK from the ages of 1 to 4 or 5, so I don't remember that quite as well. And then in Saudi, I lived there for a few years, 5 and 6 years old, and I remember that better. And the reason I was there was my father was an architect. His father was also an architect, and they were both building like hospitals around the world, basically government contracted hospitals. They did that around a bunch of places in the Middle East, and so they were kind of all over doing that sort of stuff. And so the biggest thing that I think I think a lot about with Saudi Arabia is, so I have asthma. I still have like decently intense asthma, and so in Saudi Arabia they have sandstorms and from time to time, and when that happens it kicks up so much like dust and stuff that like if you're asthmatic, like you kind of just got to stay indoors. And so that was, I think, a big. I mean, it's also just like miserably hot a lot of the time too.
Right.
So that was the other thing, and so I think because of that, and that's, those are formative years, 5-6 years old around there, and so that was where I think I really was like, all right, video games are a big part of my identity here, because they were something I could do that was, interesting and fun and exciting while indoors. Oh, and also in Saudi Arabia, I was in an American compound, or like a international compound, I guess. It was an English-speaking compound, and right down the road there was an arcade, I remember, and there would be tournaments, and I remember I still have ribbons. Because I would win these like tournaments playing like Galaga, Pac-Man, all these old retro arcade games. So there was like a little cultural center, like a little teen center, right down the road, and I remember going there all the time and playing, Defender, Galaga, those kind of classic '80s arcade games.
And so you went on to college and you studied composition. So firstly, sort of, were you very much a musical child? Do you think you had a sort of natural aptitude for it? And sort of, how is the studying of composition? Is it a very dry, scientific thing to study, or is it as creative as we would imagine?
So I went to a weird a program, actually, which was, I would say, remarkably not dry, given, most, typically, if you heard someone went to school for music composition, it's either going to be jazz or classical comp, and both of those are rather dry, usually, especially classical. But I mean, both of them are, you're studying like modes and scales and chord spelling and advanced like jazz extended chords and all this music theory stuff. And my program was a bit weird. I went to Purchase College in New York, and they have it's a very good program, but it was one of the first programs to be kind of like a pop songwriting. So the major was called studio composition, and it's really like writing pop songs in a studio was like what it was all about. And it was I think it was a very modern approach to how do you teach music in the 21st century. And so, as to whether it was always a thing, my father was a musician, not, super serious, but, he played in bands and things like that. And so it was always something that appealed to me, and it's still something that appeals to me. And I also, there's some bleed over, because in my undergrad, my first undergrad anyway, I went back. I just finished actually this year, my second time around, and got a completely different, unrelated degree. But my first time around on the undergrad, I really focused actually largely on writing video game music. So, and that's what I do now, still to this day, and that's always been a favorite kind of music of mine. And so, that's kind of where the music thing comes in. I do think that there's some, in terms of my like game design theory, I think that the way, because we did learn a lot of classical jazz music theory in my schooling, and I think that what struck me was knowing that existed in music, and then going back to games and being like, we don't really have that kind of stuff in games. Like we just seeing the starkness between this extremely developed world of music, which has had hundreds of years of institutionalized, people just researching how to better explore this space for so long, and then to go into games where, 50 years ago there was not one human being on the planet whose job it was to design games or to sort of teach games or to study games in a sort of way, and let alone an institutional knowledge on that. So so that starkness really inspired me to want to get involved and to try to generate some of my own theory that may be helpful in games, and that's how I got into writing the articles and my books and all that.
You've gone back to college and you've studied something completely different, and this is political science. What do you get from a political science degree? Why go into that area?
Well, if you're speaking generally, typically, the typical usage of a political science degree is to then go to law school or possibly work in politics. Be like work for a campaign or work for research, a political science research thing, or literally just go into higher education. Get a master's and a PhD and then teach political science or something like that. It's a little bit like one of those majors. It's a very broad and blurry major that actually brings in lots of different disciplines. So you got history in there, you've got economics, you've got sociology, you've got traditional like government. Lots of different things are taught in a political science, or at least in my experience. But for me, I actually went for none of those reasons. I don't want to be a lawyer or necessarily get into politics proper. But, one of the things that also really struck me, so my mom was actually a very political person. She was very politically active, and so she kind of really inspired me on some level to always sort of like have some try to stay somewhat aware of what's happening like in the world and in social dynamics and things like that. And what did strike me, and I think probably around the Gamergate era, it really struck me hard, was that there's a way that I guess games and music and almost any art really, you can get very sort of myopic and like seeing a very small space because, especially something like games where you can just work by yourself on something for like 2-3 years and you're just sitting in this like room by yourself, and it can be very antisocial sometimes and disconnected, and I was just noticing that in myself, that I was like, I feel like I have a flaw as an artist that I'm too closed in on my own point of view, kind of, and I think that that's visible, and it was a little bit of a complaint sometimes in some of my theoretical work, and is that it's just looking at such a tiny little spot, and I think that's a valid critique of it. And so I part of it why I went back was I want to just expand my horizons, kind of expand my point of view, so that my creativity is a bit more open and also a bit more just kind of aware of what's going on. What does it mean when I do this? What, and I don't know. It's very broad. I can get more into specifics if you ask more specific question. But in the broadest sense, I just sensed that I wasn't being part of any kind of solution with what I was doing, and I was in fact probably contributing to things that I did not want to be contributing to with some of my theory, and that was unwittingly, and it was because I was just so basement mode. And I guess that's the simplest way to put it.
We're all, I'm sure, prone to the chauvinism of the age in which we live. But sort of how remarkable do you think is the feeling of angst and uncertainty and division that we're currently experiencing in the Anglo-Saxon world?
I think it's hard to say, that's a really difficult question. I think it's very remarkable, but I also think that when you look back at previous eras, it's hard to say that what we're going through right now rivals what happened in the United States in the 60s, through the Vietnam and civil rights era. And even in the 90s, things were extremely divisive. So it's like, I guess sometimes I feel like, oh my God, that we're in the most divisive, time of all ever. And I do think that, obviously people have spoken about social media as being, and the way that, ad-driven social media particularly gets just everybody as polarized as possible because, you sort of like have this feedback loop of people clicking on links that, are designed to piss them off as much as possible, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there may be some dynamics there for sure, but I also think it's very hard to remember how divided and screwed up things were 10, 20, 30 years ago. And so I'm very concerned about the state of things now and how it really does seem like there are two worlds, at least two, like entire realities and epistemologies of like how do we know what's true and what's not, and I think there's something. My short answer is I do think that social media is a big deal. I think that it's one of these things where, and this happens all the time throughout human history, where we get some physical technology. So like, I don't know, it could be like a new kind of weapon, or it could be a new kind of, way of any kind of physical technology. And then over time, the cultural, social, and moral technology has to kind of catch up. And there's this delay time in between when those things have not caught up. And it's like a horrible situation, and there's all this really terrible damage. And so I'm hoping that in the next, 5-10 years, there is some degree of catch-up on the moral and cultural level that can help us to better use what are otherwise, fantastic tools, social media, the internet, etc.
So going on to your first game then, and this is Master of Magic. So firstly, how does a 4X game on the computer compare to one on the tabletop?
I don't think I can answer that because I don't know that I've played a lot of 4X games in tabletop exactly. Like that's not an area that I've explored that much. Maybe you can give me some examples of some 4X games that you would consider 4X tabletop.
Twilight Imperium, Eclipse, they're two very sort of big ones. A lot of Civ games fall into this kind of idea of expanding and building up your tech and building up your resources and then going out and causing havoc across the game world.
I have played Eclipse, and how does that compare? I mean, I'm tempted to just say like, so. I'm very much like about systems and rules. My knee jerk off the top of my head is I think that the digital ones are probably just better. Or actually that's maybe not a right way of saying it, but I think that the digital medium is better for that kind of thing. With that said, I think that board game designers are so much better as designers because they're so forced to actually look at rules in like a critical way that it wouldn't surprise me at all if Twilight Imperium, which I have not played, is vastly better than any digital 4X. So I think, but I do think that the medium of the digital, the computer is, I would guess, is probably a better medium for this kind of thing because, there is an issue of practicality at some point in terms of like having all kinds of components everywhere and having to do all the upkeep and maintaining all of that. I also think though that, I mean, for me, I love single player 4X. I think there's something about that experience, and I also just in general like single player games, and so I think that being able to play. I'm also really big on being able to play things quickly. Like one of my favorite activities, one of the games on my list is Race for the Galaxy, and I love playing Race for the Galaxy against the bot on the digital app. And I love just like grinding out those games of Race for the Galaxy, like just boom, 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 one in every 5 minutes or so. And I think that there's something really to that in that you actually do get to play the game more in your life. Like if you think of it, like you're only going to have so many hours that you're going to put towards a given game. I mean, maybe there's some flexibility there, but there's a finite amount to some extent. And so the more efficiently you can kind of like actually engage with that and get through that, and the more you're able to explore that system. And and then obviously I recognize that there's all kinds of stuff being lost in that, right? Like the experience, especially in something like Twilight Imperium or Eclipse, a lot of it is social, and obviously I appreciate that component, and I like social games. I love like traitor games like Battlestar Galactica and things like that. Those are really cool, and but I also, it's kind of two different things that I'm looking for. Like I guess I maybe I like my strategy games to be basically like, just let me explore this system, and I don't need to be social right now. And then I like my social games to be like, okay, make a system that's the best at bringing out cool social dynamics, and I don't really care as much about the strategy now. I like one or the other, I suppose.
And so what are your memories of Master of Magic? Because it's quite an old game at this point.
Yeah, the things that I remember best about and so I've went back and I've replayed it, over the years here and there, and I still think it's in some ways maybe my favorite digital 4X game, because a couple things. One is it has a lot of really good like componential complexity and asymmetry that you don't get in a lot of 4X games. Most 4X games do not have nearly as much asymmetry in terms of like the factions and different units and abilities and all that kind of stuff. But also like there's this really cool intermingling of, so you have in the start of Master of Magic, actually this sounds maybe silly, but one of the coolest things about Master of Magic is at the start of it you have 10 spell books that you can allocate to, I think, I don't know, 7 or 8 different colors of magic. So there's like fire magic, death magic, life magic, nature magic, et cetera, et cetera. And you can allocate freely 10 spell books to all of those. So you could have like 4 in death and 3 in life and 1 in nature. And so there's like all these combinations, and depending on which combinations you pick, that determines how good you are with those kinds of magics and also which spells that you get access to. And then after all that, then you pick like a faction, like a species or whatever. So you could be a black mage, like full black magic combined with I forget what the races are. They have like, typical sort of D&D-ish kind of races, like hobbits and orcs and I don't know. I don't remember what else. Bugmen or something. And so anyway, that was really cool that you were able to experiment with that. And so I think on like a sort of toy-like level, that really works well. 2 other quick things about Master Magic that are really fantastic. One is there's like no diplomacy. I think that diplomacy in digital 4X games has always been, it's either been like fine or a major problem, exploitable problem. And in Master of Magic, they're like, you know what? There's your diplomacy is like a binary 1 or 0, which is typically everyone just leaves you alone, but they might just go to war with you, and like that's pretty much it. Like there's very little diplomacy, which I really appreciate, because it makes it actually just directs play. It's more of a war game than like Civ, for example. There's no cultural victory. You have and it's also made clear that it's a war game because it also has tactical combat. So if you drag your stack of units onto another stack of units, you actually get this whole other screen where it has this tactical, sort of like XCOM like sub-screen of combat, and which is interesting. It's neat. Has some issues and some strengths, but anyway, it's a weird game, and there's never really been anything like it. There are some games. The closest is probably Age of Wonders Shadow Magic, but even that, it just doesn't have. It was like one of those lightning in a bottle kind of things for me, and there was a few of those in that time period on PC, and yeah, I would recommend if anyone's a 4X fan, check it out because it's an underappreciated game in my opinion.
So I want to go on now and talk about your media work and your composition. So you write a blog, you have a YouTube channel. Why is having this kind of presence online important?
I mean, okay, so let's talk about the two, one and then the other. So I'm not sure that having a blog is important at this point. I started out 10 years ago, and at that time, actually, the blogosphere and blogging was like still kind of a thing, and there was like websites like Game of Sutra. Like I was actually being paid to write articles for Game of Sutra, like, actually writing articles for money. So like there was this thing for a while where articles were this kind of like, I don't know, there was an appreciation for articles that now I think has transferred over to other mediums. I think now these days podcasts and YouTube videos are more what people are actually a little bit more interested in than articles. Not to say that no one reads articles, but there really was more of a thing. At this point, I think it wouldn't matter that much if I just never wrote an article again, assuming nothing changes culturally. I don't, I write articles because I do have some people who follow my work and are interested in that kind of stuff, but also for my own purposes. I write articles to help me flesh out my own thoughts on a given topic on a game design theory thing, or a lot of times it's like a dev journal type of thing. So it's useful in certain things, but it's not important in some sort of career way or anything like that. YouTube, I think that would be an avenue that is more promising. I think that there's a lot of growth in YouTube. If you want to like build a channel, it's a lot, I think, easier to do that right now, and that is something that I've experimented with. The issue is that making like really high production quality videos is a lot of work, and I would have to basically make that my main thing in order to do it justice, I think. And but I still have a channel, and I do Twitch streams and things like that, and I'll throw videos and highlights and things like that up. And then of course I have a podcast of my own, which is called the Clockwork Game Design Podcast, and that to me is my most maybe successful thing right now, because podcasts they're not quite as much work as a video, or not nearly as much work as a video. And, or at least, I mean, the way I make podcasts, it's not. And they're also people are really into podcasts right now. It's like, it's definitely a thing that people are excited about. So that's something that, of all the media stuff I do, I think the podcast is the most promising, and the thing that I sort of am prioritizing the most these days.
And so talking about music then, what are the specific challenges of writing music specifically for games, as opposed to, writing music just for people to listen to?
Well, there's a lot of different schools of thought on that. There's some people who really like the idea of music that's interactive, that sort of responds to player inputs and stuff like that. I am extremely skeptical about that. And I am much more of the school, very much of the, you mentioned Mega Man. Mega Man 2 and 3 are some of my favorite video game music ever. If I could just write music that's like Mega Man 2 and 3 all the time, that would be great. I would love to do that. Also Castlevania. So I'm much more of the school of, I want some tunes, I want some songs. I don't love the 2000s, 2010 era movement in video games soundtracks to be much more like film soundtracks, and not just like film soundtracks, but like the film soundtracks in 2000s and 2010. So not like John Williams, where you have like ba ba da ba 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 da, like all these big themes, but instead it's just kind of these generic like fantasy things where you just like have these like pad chords, and they just don't have a lot of identity, and they work great in the films and in the games. They get the job done, but I'm a composer, and I love melody and music that has identity from its notes. Like the notes itself are what is giving it the identity. I also can appreciate production and other qualities too, but ultimately I'm very much a person. It's similar to how I am with games. I'm in the games for the rules, and I'm in the music for the notes. Yeah. So I'm very much like I love Mario music, Final Fantasy music, those kind of things. That era of music, and there are new composers doing that kind of stuff, and I appreciate it a lot.
Do you think this movement to make game music more in keeping with cinema and things like that is because there is this movement to quantify games as art much more, and so people are wanting to compose music that is art rather than music that complements a game?
I think that's part of it. Yeah, I do think that's part of it, but I think that there's something like more nefarious there too, which is that games in particular are like, I feel like they're the most commodified art form like in all of human history or something. There's some relationship that games have as this cultural artifact that appears in the 1980s. And when you think about everything that was going on in politics and economic thought in the 1980s and how that went forward to today and how video games were there every step of that. So I think that there's a real relationship between video games and the economic worldview of the late 20th century, and so I think that that's really what that's about. I think melody and specificness don't make for as good products. I mean, there's like the old lowest common denominator thing. I think that the idea is with these huge movies that are, made now, I would like to call out Disney. I just saw Frozen 2, and I think it's a very good example of I mean, I like the music, I like the production, I like the art, I like many of the things about Frozen 2, but overall it struck me as very much like one of these like, how do we make like a roller coaster ride for everybody and make it sort of as I mean, lowest common denominator doesn't sound like strong enough for what I'm saying. But that will work as a product, that will be a functional commodity first and foremost. And I think that when art has too much identity and too much personality and too much individuality and too much of a point of view, it starts to be conflict with its commodity state or its ability to be consumed. And so I think that is, I would explain that as, or at least to me, it feels more important to highlight that as a reason why video games have gone the direction they've gone in terms of video game music. Because, what I'm realizing now, like I didn't realize it at the time, but if you go back and you listen to like some of these, Super Nintendo and NES soundtracks and Koji Kondo and these composers and what they were doing and what they were influenced by, a lot of them were influenced by like weird, obscure like Yellow Magic Orchestra and like 70s like fusion jazz and stuff that's very particular, like that's and a lot of these productions were small, I mean, video games were almost in the early days, they were all indies, they were all these small teams of like 10, 20 people or less. And so my point is that those decisions were coming out of, they were more like individual art decisions, I guess, and less like these huge art by committee, how do we make something that will just, check the boxes kind of decisions. So yeah, I mean, I think that that's the way I would phrase it. In terms of the art thing, I think that that's also true, and I think that there has been that awakening that, oh yeah, video games are art. It has been an important part of how that's that has been important part of growth for games, but I think that I don't think that would necessarily lead you to. Well, I guess yeah. I think that's part of it. Is games are trying to emulate film, right? They've been trying to emulate film for a long time since it became technologically possible. And I do think that one of the ways that we can say, "Hey, look, my game is art," is by saying, "Hey, look, my game looks like a movie," or and so yeah, and that's part of it too, for sure.
So your next game then is Super Smash Bros. 64. And so firstly, how groundbreaking is this game? And do you think it was a paradigm shift for the fighting genre?
Absolutely. I feel very strongly about that. And I just went back recently. I've been playing some Smash Bros. 64. I played all of the Smash Bros. Games. I played 64 the most. I played Melee a ton. And I played them all. And I like them all for different things, but I do think that 64 was revolutionary for fighting games, and arguably it shouldn't even be in the same genre, maybe, as things like Street Fighter and Tekken and things like that. Because it now becomes a completely different. I mean, the two major innovations were, the damage percentage system as opposed to a traditional health bar, and the fact that the level was no longer going to just be this empty rectangle. Now the level was going to have platforms, and it's going to have other things that you can interact with, and the spaces on the levels actually mean a lot. So if I'm pushed way to the left on the level and I get smashed, hit very hard, that makes it more likely that I'm going to be knocked out because, where I was knocked from also matters. So there's all these dynamics there, and that's the kind of stuff that I really get excited about is, opportunities for emergent complexity to happen. And there's just so much more of that because everything is physics based in Smash Brothers, especially in 64. And one of my complaints about the latest game is that, or the last few games, really, since Brawl, is that they've become more. So they've sort of balanced everything, quote unquote, by making it so that the trajectories for most Smash attacks are kind of canned now. They're less like sort of emergent. There was some like really degenerate, like broken stuff you can do in 64. That's just really is quite unfair in terms of like a formal competitive strategy game. But it was also very emergent and wild and surprising. Now the latest one is more. It kind of just feels a little bit more like a regular fighting game. I think they sort of backed off from that a little bit, and because something like in Smash 64, you can ring out somebody at 40% if you just like hit them at the right time, at the right place. Now it's like you're kind of guaranteed to like live to 100% damage or more, and so what that basically means is it's a little bit more like a health bar. You just kind of got to fill up that damage percentage, and it functions more like a health bar. So anyway, yes, Smash Brothers, revolutionary, brilliant design. I wish there was more of that kind of innovation. If there was more of that kind of innovation happening, I feel like that the fact that we don't have more Smash Brothers like things is the reason that I wanted to get into writing game design theory. Is that there's so many games that come out that aren't doing what I think the original Smash Brothers did.
And so my sort of one enduring love in the digital game world is Mario Kart. And it's been a very stormy love affair because I fell in love with the first version, the SNES version, which I thought was an absolute masterpiece. And I found as the systems got more powerful, the games got denuded of their skill and they got denuded of their charm because they could do more things. The levels could be more complex, but then, that compromises the human's ability to control it. And it's only with 8 that I think they've struck a kind of balance and that it's still, and it feels good again. So do you think that processing power necessarily equals good game design?
Oh no, absolutely not. I mean, I've long said that, so take Smash Brothers 64. You could have made that on the Atari 2600. You know what I mean? Like, I think that, like, just taking the Atari 2600 or the NES as an example, either of those have all the processing power we need to do anything, like, not anything, but like they 90% of the cool, interesting ideas that we could come up with could have been done on those platforms. So I think that there's actually like very, very little relationship between good game design and technology. And I mean, look at, we're the best game design in the world is made with cardboard. Like these a lot of tabletop games. So I don't think there's any relationship there. I think what the relationship is between technology and like this kind of consumer, commodification thing. And that's really how video games exist and survive, is by having these new technological barriers that they can advertise. The 16-bit era, the 32-bit, the CD-ROM, the Wiimote jiggle helmet, or whatever the fuck. Sorry.
You can swear, that's fine.
All right, yeah. But yeah, so I think that those kinds of those kinds of technological things are much more about selling products, blast processing, and all that kind of stuff. And that's really, I think, what that's about. In terms of design, I think we had everything we needed, in like 1990. And that's not, I mean, there may be a few designs that, like, so for example, VR, or the Wiimote, or I think all of these things, which I would generally call gimmicks, have probably a few designs in them or could inspire some designs that wouldn't have been inspired without those technology. So I'm not trying to say they're completely useless or completely gimmicks. But I do think it's important, given especially how much hype there is behind all these things, to push the other way and be like, you can write the next brilliant, like, genius design in QBasic. Just go do it. It's a matter of ingenuity and work and iteration and interaction and playtesting and all, just the hard work of game design. And also it's a matter of us as a species developing the institutions of game design and the theory and the tools to do good game design. So it's intellectual technology, not physical technology, that we really need in order to move forward.
So I want to go on then and talk about your game design. So you've not just designed digital games, you've also designed analog games. What is the connection between those two forms of design? Are they essentially the same, or do they vary in very fundamental ways?
Not fundamental ways. They vary in I would say largely superficial ways, but they are superficial ways that end up mattering on a practical level a lot. So, as an example, when you're designing for tabletop, you constantly have to be thinking about, is this too fiddly? Is this too, like, is there a way for players to keep track of this? Do I have room in the box for this extra component? There's all these practical considerations that are not on a fundamental game design level, but that are, just practical considerations, basically. And so you have to constantly be working around that and designing around that. And, I think that, especially in this era when we don't have a lot of theory, a lot of times when you don't have a lot of theoretical tools and institutional, like, knowledge, those kinds of limitations actually can end up helping more than hurting, because they force you to make hard decisions. They force you to think hard about, do you need this card? Do you need this component? And do you need this rule? And that alone has, I think, triggered the last 20 years of this, like, board game revolution, which is to me showing by far the greatest game design work that we've ever seen. And so yeah, fundamentally they're not, but fundamentally they're the same. Ultimately, at the end of the day, you're coming up with rules, And like I said, I think games are fundamentally abstract. They are neither cardboard nor are they bits and bytes and sprites or whatever. They are fundamentally rules, and they exist at some point they're going to exist in the mind of a human being, and that's when they actually become real. They're until a person puts the rules in their brain and then starts interacting with it. That's when the game actually exists. Until that point, it's just some, it's not really a game. And so yeah, fundamentally it's the same. And I also think that in terms of like my theory work, I think that I've always said that my theory applies completely equally to digital games and to physical games. So yeah, I don't think they're fundamentally different at all. I mean, I think, but then you can get into like sort of subgenres, like, well, what about party games? And of course, then you have all kinds of different considerations. But I do think that a digital party game will have very similar considerations as a physical party game, as an example.
Jackbox feels like a party game in a box, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So what makes your games unique, or is uniqueness unobtainable?
Well, I would actually say that probably most games, I think uniqueness is actually not terribly hard to obtain. I think that well, okay, so I'll just answer your first question directly. What makes my games most unique, I think, is that they're kind of experiments in that they're really part of. So I am both trying to make games in a traditional way of like, hey, I want to make a cool game that would be fun to play. This is the game that I want to play, so I want to make that type of thing. But at the same time, they are also theory experiments. So like, I'm always working with certain like theoretical assumptions and hypotheses, I guess you could say, and then I make a game which is a test of that theory, and to some extent. And so I think that I would guess if someone were to play my games, they would either be just very confused by some of them and be like, what is this? I don't get it. Or if they were a more, and my experience has been that with some people who are more theory-minded or more game designers themselves, I think, they may be able to see better that like, oh, I see what he was going for here. I see like what the sort of the idea was here. And so I think that makes my games unique. I also think, though, that especially with Dragon Bridge, the game that I just kickstarted a few months ago, and with my newest game, which I just sort of announced yesterday, which is a turn-based tactical game, kind of like XCOM or Advance Wars, and that takes place in the same universe as Dragon Bridge. And this universe is a very silly, kind of Adventure Time inspired, but also with my own like weird, wacky style on it. But then also on top of that, it's also a deeply political game with that tries to speak directly to like the politics of our time. So I hope that is also something that people see and think it's unique. But I also think uniqueness is not the thing I would prioritize so much as maybe identity or just like specificity. I can't say that word, but
specificity.
Yes, that word. Where someone's like, okay, this is distinct. I can tell this is, there's an expression of a person coming through here. And I will say this. I think that Dragon Bridge and my new game, Gem Wizards Tactics, those games are me. Like, they express me very hard. And if you don't like them, maybe you won't like me. And so I think that, on some level, like, that's kind of what art is about kind of sending out an image of yourself into the world and maybe hoping to connect with people on it.
So I want to go on to your next game then, and this is Nethack. This is a roguelike. So for those people who may not be aware of what that means, can you define what a roguelike is?
Sure. I mean, like all definitions of this type, there are all kinds of arguments and different definitions floating around, but typically a roguelike, so in 1980 there was a game called Rogue that came out, and roguelikes are a genre sort of game that largely emulate this game Rogue. So the qualities of Rogue are it's turn-based, it's top-down, tile-based, you're in a dungeon fighting monsters, collecting loot, leveling up, and when your character runs out of hit points, the match ends and there's no way to like reload or save scum or anything like that. So it's a one and done affair, often referred to as permadeath, which I don't love that term, but it's what I would say is it's like an old arcade game, or it's like Tetris, where yeah, of course you can't rewind after you lose in Tetris. Like what? But because it has sort of RPG trappings, and people sort of expect in an RPG to be able to, save scum and reload and do things over and basically like be guaranteed victory, as you are in most RPGs. The roguelike, as it came into modern popular consciousness, became very much associated with this permadeath concept that like, oh my god, they're so cruel. They make you, when you die, you can't just reload until you succeed. And so, but the way I look at it is much like how I would look at a competitive game. Like, yeah, sometimes you lose, and or like Tetris, like, it's a score-based thing. So anyway, that's what roguelikes are like, and Nethack is probably the most well-known and complex roguelike in existence that I'm aware of.
And I was reading about it, and it's got an extensive Wikipedia page and all this sort of stuff, and it talks about that this is a game that a lot of people have taken on themselves, and they've developed and redeveloped, and it's still being iterated and patched and rethought of to this day. Is it something that you've tinkered about with yourself?
No. So here's the thing with Nethack. I put it on the list because... So I do have an extensive roguelike knowledge, and in fact, my first published game was a roguelike called 100 Rogues for iPhone. So I know roguelikes quite well, but I never played Nethack that much. But I am aware of what Nethack is, and I've read through its wiki and had that thing where you go through the wiki and you're like, wait, this is in this game? Like, how could that be? This can't possibly be really in this game, and it is. And so the amount of inherent complexity and emergent complexity in Nethack is just staggering. I'm aware of that, and so that's why it would be this was one of my, like, if it were, what do I want to be trapped with games. And yeah, so I can speak about roguelikes more broadly, and specific roguelikes that I've loved the most, I will say real quickly, are Dungeon Crawl Stone Soup, which is a little bit like Nethack, and also has a very long 30-year development history, which is still going on today, quite like Nethack. Or not 30-year, maybe like, I don't know, 20, maybe it is 30 years at this point, actually. And then the other one I really love, and I recommend so hard to anyone out there that's listening, is Mystery Dungeon Shiren the Wanderer, which originally came out on Super Famicom and was re-released on the Nintendo DS. And I can't recommend that one enough. If you've never played a roguelike, just play this game. It's extremely deep. Definitely the most complex, deep, surprising Super Nintendo game by far. And yeah, it's quite incredible, that one.
So I want to talk now, because I don't consider myself part of the video game community. I certainly consider myself part of the board game community, though I'm sure they would wish I wasn't. But from looking from the outside in, the video game community seems like a war zone. Is this true when you're in it yourself?
So just speaking from my own experience, from 2010 to 2016 or 2017, yes, absolutely, definitely. I do feel as though things have sort of taken a shift in the last year, and I'm not exactly sure whether that's true or whether that's just my own experience. But as a general rule, absolutely. If you go to a video game conference or convention, it's very intense, like an oppressive feeling. It's like a very like a mix of sort of like a very corporate feeling mixed with like a locker room kind of atmosphere. There's just like machine gun sound effects everywhere, and like everyone's yelling stuff, and it's I mean, I may be overstating it, but I've been to a good amount of larger conferences, like ones like PAX and like GDC, and they're kind of like that. Internet, so I go on a lot of Discords, and that's kind of like where I think a lot of gaming culture is living these days, is on Discord. And I actually I wrote my senior thesis. It was an 80-page paper to get my political science degree on reactionary politics and gamer culture. That was the title of my paper. And so for that, I actually did a lot of research on like field research on gamers. And yeah, it's not good. And I think there's a lot of interesting reasons for that. But to answer your question, if you have a follow-up question, I can answer it. But yes, to answer your question, yeah, it is, from my perspective, it is quite like what it looks like from the outside. League of Legends developer Riot just, I think, paid $100 million to in lawsuit settlement fines to its female employees. If I'm not mistaken, something along those lines, because of all these like years and years of harassment complaints and various related issues. And so yeah, no, it's an intensely gate-kept community. It's especially on lines of gender. It's a hyper, like neoliberal, like commodified. Everything's commodified. Everything is judged and ranked, and who's better and who's worse, and like who it's just a very difficult place to live in, I think. And but I do have reason to believe that it's getting a little bit better. And I know in some ways it is absolutely getting better. I mean, we've seen big pushes for inclusion, different kinds of games, the art games movement, the game zinester movements, and queer games, and a lot of different kinds of games which are pushing back against these dominant sort of aesthetics within video games. And so I think there's room to be hopeful, and but in the short answer is we've got a ways to go.
So I read an essay by you about violence in video games and sort of your attitude and how there is an issue with game design with regards to violence. And there's been a lot of debate recently because Trump comes out and blames gun violence in America on video games. It seems to be a convenient scapegoat. But do you think violence in games encourages real world violence? And if it doesn't, because a lot of people are saying, when you think about the bikini warrior trope and the accusations of misogyny in video games, if violence in video games doesn't encourage real-world violence, how does misogyny in video games encourage real-world misogyny?
Yeah, so I think that, firstly, to take off the table the idea that real-world violence is caused by portrayals of violence. I think that a lot of times I think that's actually kind of used as a bit of a maybe a straw man, sort of, to be like, okay, well, if that's not true, then we can just ditch looking at violence at all, so yeah, I've never made the claim that violence is caused by or the violent behavior is caused by portrayals of violence, but there's all kinds of stuff between literally turn someone into a murderer and no effect at all, right? So like there could be some kind of effect in the middle there where, maybe it doesn't make someone more violent, but maybe it makes them more amenable to like authoritarian or fascistic ways of thinking, or maybe like they're more inclined to be accepting of harsh criminal justice law, or maybe like there's all kinds of ways in which it could be affecting us in some sort of negative way. And I would say the same thing about portrayals of misogyny or homophobia or anything else. I think that there is something to what is normalized, what is considered like normal behavior in culture, what is aesthetically preferred, what is aesthetically found disgusting in our culture, and those kind of questions. And I think that art is not only one of our most powerful tools for interacting with that sort of like layer of human understanding and meaning and the social layer, it might be like our only real tool that we have if we want to make changes on that level. Like, how do people think about each other? How do people think about compassion? How do they think about race? How do they think about gender? I think that, art in general, and maybe even more so video games in some ways, is one of the only ways that we have of like piercing into that layer and kind of like, changing how people think about stuff. I think that's what's great about art. I think that's what we love about art. And one of the things is that it can change people. It can be transformative. It can change how you think about a certain thing. So I think that I would say that the claim that violence causes game violence causes real life violence or not is a straw man, like a red herring question. To me it's not about that at all. To me it's about what, if any, are the effects of violent media, and not just violent media. I mean, to me, actually, my feelings on violence in games has changed. I actually wrote a new piece in the last year where I'm actually now more okay with violence in a broad sense. And my problem has always been about violence glorification, by the way, more so than just violence. In fact, there's some violence in media that I absolutely love because it's not glorified at all. But now I realize, now having gone to school for political science and all that, now I feel like actually, though, the question is not whether there's violence or not, but like, what is the violence being done in the name of? Like, why is the violence happening? And that may be even more of an important question than whether there's violence. So, now I'm thinking about things like, in the archetypical, bad guy is going to come and kill everything story, and the good guys have to stop them, that it's always this violence in the defense of the status quo, which is like an interesting thing to think about. Like, I had never really thought about that before. But it's true. Like, so many of these stories are just about like, oh, how do we just defend the status quo? And it's like, if you're in a situation in your life where the status quo is working pretty good for you, then that's like kind of an appealing story. But if you are a person who is like, very oppressed or has like very few prospects or lives in like a horrible situation, I can see how that story might read differently to you, and that's the kind of thing that I'm thinking about more and more these days.
So your next game, then, is one you've already mentioned. You mentioned it at the top of the show. And this is Dwarf Fortress. How important is this game?
It's very important. I think, so this is another one like Nethack that I have very little interest in actually playing. But it is, it's probably it's the most remarkable achievement in digital games history, period.
So could you briefly explain what it is and why it would promote that kind of content?
Yeah. It's a world. It's kind of hard to explain what it is. I mean, I guess technically it's the main mode is you're building a little fortress for your dwarves, and you tell your dwarves what to do, and they do their thing, and I guess on a very superficial level, you could say it's kind of like one of those like sim games or like tycoon games or something like that. But to think it's nothing like those because only in the most sort of surface level ways is it like those. It's what it does when you start a match of a game of Dwarf Fortress. You'll see that it generates not just a world. So it generates a world map, right, that you're going to be operating in, but it also generates like thousands of years of historical events that happen. Like when we talk about a world, it's like functioning rivers and lakes, and like a biometric, like a biome system, like an ecosystem that is all like kind of working, and then like an underground, like all kinds of weird underground stuff that's all connected to like legends, and then once you start playing, your dwarves all have emotions. They get experiences. So they might see something. They might see somebody get killed or see something happen, and now they're like permanently scarred by that thing, and they're always thinking about it, and they start behaving. They have some of the most complex, advanced AI. Not some of. They have the most complex, advanced AI of any like NPC character like in any video game that I'm aware of. Feel free to correct me, but I feel pretty confident about this. And part of that's because the world that they live in is so complex. Like literally there's water physics. So like if there's like water in an area and then there's like a little space underneath it and you drill a hole, the water will all kind of like go into that hole realistically. You can create plumbing systems that work dynamically. Everything it's the most realistic world simulator that I think we've created. And interestingly enough, it also has like, well, I don't know, I think they may have recently added graphics of some kind, but for the many years it's been worked on, it only had ASCII graphics, like literally, alphanumeric characters to represent everything, because the designer Tarn Adams was just like, I don't have time to make art. This is the beta, this is the alpha version or whatever. And he'd been working on it. I think he's still working on it now. He's got like a Patreon and stuff. I think it's got to be getting up there about 30 years or 25 years that he's been, more like 25 years that he's been working on it. And it's just going and going and going. And that's also another remarkable thing about it is it's made basically by one person. And he just keeps adding to it and adding to it and adding to it and fixing things and making things better and deeper. And here's what I would say. If you want to be wowed by Dwarf Fortress, I mean, you could play it for sure. You could also watch videos of people playing it and just see the amazing stuff that happens. Or another thing that I love about Dwarf Fortress is, and I did actually play it for a little while, and I remember one match I had and I played and nothing happened. Like, nothing remarkable happened. And I was like, you know what? This is great, because this means that it's not like just canned, delivering me here's the AI director saying that you have an exciting moment planned at 3 hours in or something. It's emergent. It's completely emergent, and that means sometimes it'll be boring. But what I would really recommend people do, that's a very practical thing that you actually can do, because it's kind of hard to learn how to play, is just go to the Dwarf Fortress wiki and click on random page and do that like about 5 or 10 times and read the random pages. And every time I do that, I'm like, it's another one of those things like Nethack where I'm like, wait, this is in the game? Like you can do this and this actually means something? Like, yeah, it's mind blowing. So it's definitely a good one. I recommend anyone take the Dwarf Fortress with them to the cabin in the woods.
So I want to talk now about the future for you. What do you have coming up in the future? And you designed a card game. And what is the development with that, and how successful has that been? And do you see that hitting sort of conventional retail?
So my card game, this was a very small card game Kickstarter. It was about 150 people that are going to get a copy of the game. I'm going to do a print run about 2 or 3 times that size and sell them, from my website, and pretty much if I can maybe set up some other places to sell it from, that'd be great too. I do think it's a really, really good card game, but it was my first time doing a card game at all, like a published card game, and I was like learning a lot on the job, and also my turnaround on that game was ridiculously fast. I started it in like July or something from scratch largely, and then by like September I had this Kickstarter going or somewhere around there, and so I do want to make it. I would love to make it into a retail game. It's just, the board. It's starting to get very crowded in the board game Kickstarter space, and I have my fingers in a lot of pies. I'm doing a lot of different things at once, and so it's hard. It will be difficult for me to make that into as big of a thing as I would like it to be. But what's for me in the future, games-wise, is I would love to take Dragon Bridge however far I can take it. I also want to make more card games, and I intend to, some point next year, do another much larger card game, probably in the same universe, the Gem Wizards universe. And I have digital games, too, so I'm working on one digital game right now. I am still working on Jelly Bomber a little bit here and there with Dino Farm Games. That's the company that made that, and Oro. And I'm making my podcast and my blog and all those kinds of things. So yeah, that's kind of what I'm doing for now, and I'm going to do that as long as I can. At some point, I may have to get a job in the industry or possibly or doing teaching or something along those lines. But for now, I can afford to keep at this, and so that's kind of what I'm doing. And I'm really hopeful about Gem Wizards Tactics. I think that it's unusually like kind of a normal style of game. It's a turn-based squad tactics game. I think that's something that there's a big audience for that out there, and yet I'm also doing some very, I think, revolutionary, different, weird things with it. So I'm very optimistic and hopeful about that. But it's tough, these days being an indie developer, board game or digital is very difficult. And so we'll see how it goes. But I'm keeping at it because there's nothing I would rather be doing.
So your last game then is the only analog game that you have on your list, and this is Race for the Galaxy. So almost everyone says this game is wonderful. Why is that, do you think?
Okay, so I think one reason is it's based on Puerto Rico, which is also wonderful, and just a very well. So Race for the Galaxy. The short answer is it's a very well designed game. I mean, it has very elegant rules that do a lot with a little. It has, it kind of, I guess what I would say is there's a lot of games that I've played that are more like Euro games that have really strong rules, but then very few components. Typically, like Puerto Rico is a great example of that. There's the rules are awesome and strong, but there's like this one set of buildings and that's it pretty much. And you just play with those over and over again. And there's very little componential complexity as you would find in like something like Magic the Gathering or something. On the other hand, the American sort of aesthetic, I guess you could say, or card game aesthetic would be like Magic the Gathering or some of these tabletop games, or even like things like D&D, where the amount of components, quote unquote, is like infinite, as large as you can, imagine. And Race for the Galaxy is interesting because and I think there's been some games since then that have also emulated this, but it had the strength of a Euro rule set with the components of a American style or card game style, Magic style card game. And I think that might be what it is, and it's really tough to pull that off because typically the more complex your rules are, the harder it is to create a lot of different content that will be balanced and that will be won't like ruin everything and vice versa. But race seems to have like just kind of like nailed it. And it's also it's just, I think it's also the fact that it has such a good digital version, two really good digital versions. It's got the free one on that you can find on the web, and then it's also got on PC, and then it's also got a fantastic one on mobile devices. For me, that's a major plus. I also thought it was really interesting and smart of them to create the game and the expansions at the same time. That's something that also I had not really seen that done before, particularly in like a Euro space. So I think that might be what it was. Is that it was like this weird marriage of like card games and Euro games, and that just seemed to really work out really well.
So I've got one last question then. So you're heading off to the cabin. You're herring down the road, 88 miles an hour, and you go around the corner. The back seat of the car, the back door of the car flies open. 4 of the games fly out down a ravine into a river and are swept away for all eternity. Which game do you hope, either virtually or actually, is sitting on the back seat of the car?
So I have to ask you a question first before I answer this, and that's is the spirit of your question, like, I think the spirit of your question is, I think probably what you want to know is me, like, what's my emotional, personal, like, what do I love, right? Not what would strategically be the best thing for me to grab, because
but you can interpret that question in any way you wish to interpret it.
Okay, I see. Okay. Let's see. And there are other people. You can play multiplayer games in this world, right?
Right.
God, that's hard. I think I would grab a Master of Magic, actually, probably, because that's a good mix of kind of this big thing that you can explore for a long time, but also I have a lot of romance for it, and I just kind of like love it as an artifact. So I would probably grab Master of Magic, I guess.
So if people want to get hold of you, they want to listen to your podcast, read your blog, buy your books, where can they get hold of you?
Yeah, you can find all of that stuff over at my website. It's at keithburgun.net. And from there, I've got, all the up at the top, I've got links to my books, my podcast. We have a Discord. And I also have a Patreon, which you can, if you enjoy any of my work, you can support the Patreon and get all my games for free. And I have a good 3 or 4 games out now that patrons get access to, and that's about it. Other than that, subscribe to me on Twitch, because I'm often on Twitch. That's twitch.tv/Keith Burgun. And you can follow me on Kickstarter, because I will be probably doing a Kickstarter next year. But yeah, everything is available there at keithburgun.net, including a link to sign up to my mailing list, which is particularly good if you're interested in my games coming up. So yeah, that's about it.
Well, Keith Burgun, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
You can support the show in many ways. You can tell your friends. You can talk about it on social media. You can talk about it in your own blog, podcast, or video. Or you can support it directly by going to patreon.com/5G4D for a rolling donation, or for a one-off donation, hitting the PayPal link at the bottom of the website, 5gamesfordoomsday.com. It's these donations that keep the show going. Also, if you want to say something nice about the show, or if you want to say something horrible about the show, you can contact me on Twitter at 5gamesfordoomsday, or send me an email at 5gamesfordoomsday@gmail.com. And if I've managed to escape the aftershocks of late-stage capitalism and all the big-cheeked hamster-käufer, I'll see you in 2 weeks for another 5 Games for Doomsday.